Hey, Philip Gregory here with Philip Gregory Speaks, back for another video on talking about some of the supposed proofs for God's existence. Last time I went through the cosmological argument, which is the first cause argument, and also cosmological argument is as well talks about fine tuning, which I didn't get into that one because I sort of consider those two separate things, because really I think the fine-tuning argument fits in with more with the teleological argument, but sometimes people group that with cosmological, and so because it's based on cosmology. But so I'll touch a little bit on the fine-tuning with this one, and this video is about the teleological argument, which is the argument, basically the Watchmaker argument, which was most famously put forth by William Paley, where he gave the example: if you were walking on a beach and you suddenly discovered a watch laying in the sand, you would pick it up and see all the complicated mechanics of this watch and say, wow, this is something that's extremely complex. And so this must have had some kind of designer, because all the other things we see around us that are complex have designers. So if you didn't know what that watch was, you would look at its design alone and say, someone made this. So that's a super brief summary of what the teleological argument says, which I'm just going to start calling the Watchmaker argument, because that's famously known for that. Basically, the Watchmaker argument says because something is complex, it must have been designed, because all other things we see that are complex are designed. But it also has some strains of the argument, depending on who you talk to, have a very specific addition, which is that the complexity seems to show some sort of purpose. In other words, to add to Paley's argument, it wouldn't be just that you looked at the watch that you found on the beach and that you said, this looks extremely complex, oh, so there must be a designer, but that you would look at the complexity and from that complexity infer that the watch had a purpose of telling time, and that it was designed for that particular purpose. So that's, I think, more modern argument, what's being pressed now, because that wraps in with fine-tuning argument. And the fine-tuning argument is sort of extension of that, which basically says that if the conditions weren't exactly right, how they are, if our Earth was 10% closer to the sun, if we didn't have all the variables that we have that make the conditions for life possible set where they are, well, then we wouldn't have any life. And so that complexity, that fine-tuning of the universe, is seen as evidence for God's existence, based on the basic premises of the Watchmaker argument. So I'm going to go ahead and go through this, why that's just absolutely does not, once again, prove the existence of God, and it does not prove a designer. One problem with this argument is that just because there is a delicate balance of life, where conditions are riding on a thin sheet of ice that can crack at any moment and wipe out entire races and civilizations and species, that doesn't mean that that's necessarily a good thing, or that it's necessarily something that's being maintained. If we look at the history of any species, including the human species, there was a time several thousand years ago where our species was this close to being wiped out, as far as what we know from archaeology and what we studied of natural selection and the evolution of our species, where we think we come from, based on the sciences and information we have. It looks like we've just about almost been wiped out. So we were this close to being extinct, and we can look around us everywhere in archaeological history and biological history and see that there's species being wiped out of existence every 5 seconds, practically, even today. So the conditions weren't favorable for those species, and so it's a little bit solipsistic to think that that because we've been able to survive because conditions are just right for us, that everything was designed with us in mind. because these other species are being routinely destroyed, and if something should slightly change, then we would ultimately be destroyed as well. Now you could say that God is, well, that just proves that God is keeping everything just right for us. But then it goes back to the question I always ask people when they're talking about miracles in the same line of thought, where they say, "Oh, a tsunami hit and my family was saved. It must have been a miracle for God." And then I say, "Well, what about the others? The others weren't good enough to save. Why is it? Oh, why is that called a miracle that you're saved, but the 10,000 people that were wiped out and killed, you don't think about that? Or why is the baby that gets sick and makes it through delivery, it's a miracle from God, but the one that's born with a mental handicap, or the one that's born deformed, or the ones that die stillbirth, that's not God." And so it's kind of not giving equal credit to God in these areas. And I think back on the Watchmaker argument, there's more of the same, where we want to credit the fine tuning that's favorable to us to God, but we don't want to credit the fact that fine tuning is also, if you want to phrase it a different way, it's thin edge on the edge of destruction at all times. It's not just tuned, it's precariously placed. And if conditions were to change, our species and many others on this earth would instantly cease to be. So, but we don't attribute that to God. So, a little long-winded, but basically what I'm getting at is here that fine-tuning is not necessarily something good, and it's not necessarily tuned. It just means that the conditions happen to be set at a very small odds of favorable conditions to live, and that's where it's writing. But that doesn't mean that it was set that way, and it doesn't really make any sort of sense to me that it would be. As far as probability for our survival, probability for us to evolve, things like that, I think that theologians and people that are misquoting some of these scientific things in arguing for God's existence, I think they don't fully understand, or they're trying to slip it by us without us catching it. That they're not representing probability correctly when it comes to natural selection and biological evolution. Like I talked about in the other video, there's a difference between abiogenesis, how things originated, and how things developed after life began. And so I don't think anybody is saying they know exactly what the conditions were in the beginning of the universe, or that they know exactly how life began. We're just merely saying that it is probable, and probable is different than likely, and probable is different than chance. Probability is an actual scientific term with certain calculations. Now, the probability of something to pop into existence, as far as we know, as far as the calculations, is well within the realm of possibility. Talking about beginning with maybe RNA codes or a simpler form of coding, it is possible that could happen. Is it possible for a human to go poof and pop into existence in all the complexity that we see now? Absolutely not, and no one's arguing that. No one would say that the odds for that linear type of thought is extremely improbable. But that's not what cumulative selection and natural selection is, and that's not how any of the people arguing for evolution say that evolution came to be. Rather, they say that after life has begun, after abiogenesis of some sort, whatever the first cause for that was, that we have ample evidence to show that natural selection among biological processes, natural selection did occur and has occurred and is occurring. Now, even if you accept that, if you accept what I say there, you may be tempted to say, but that's still impossible, because going back to this argument from complexity and this Watchmaker argument, look at the complexity of the human eye. Look at all the inner working parts, and without each of these, without each of these things, take one away, and the whole thing falls apart and it ceases to function. They're all independent or interdependent on each other. And so they'll say that the probability of that human eye evolving is astronomically low. But first of all, you have to ask yourself, how can you equate the probability of something, a specific thing, like an eye and everything in its form that it is now, the probability of that evolving, if you don't know the conditions and the variables which existed at the beginning of the universe, which we've already said that the scientists and the religious Christians should admit to, that no one knows that exactly. We know more about it each day, and science is striving towards that, but we don't know exactly the conditions, and so you can't calculate a probability number without knowing the conditions of which to set the values. So first of all, that's kind of trying to calculate or saying how probable or improbable the eye could be is going about it the wrong way. What we should be doing is saying is looking at natural selection as it actually is theorized, which is that the eye did not pop into existence. The eye and its complexity did not poof out of some gelatin mass, but that it's slowly evolved over billions of years, going up a chain of evolution from simpler eyes. And there's examples of that in nature now and in fossil records that and people say there isn't, but there's plenty of bridge I can't think of what I'm trying to say. Bridge species, bridge manifestations of the eye where there's simpler eyes, and so you have to just say, well, how good is an eye that can't see in color? That doesn't make any sense. Well, it's better than no eye at all. And so at whatever point a creature has an eye, or any type of eye, whether it's a lower form than ours or the extremely complex one that we have now, it still is better than no vision at all. And so as natural selection is going, it's constantly improving those things as it's needed, only when it's needed. And so over billions of years, you absolutely could get from a simple RNA molecule to the human beings we see today that have all these complicated processes and things that are evolved because they needed to evolve. Now, if they hadn't needed to be involved, then we wouldn't have the eye we have. There, for whatever reason, having the exact complexity of an eye that we have was beneficial to our species, and that's why we have it. And so yeah, it's not a linear thing where we go from nothing. We just, like, I've seen lots and lots of Christian videos on YouTube and other places where they say the scientist would have you believe that the life and all its complexity and everything you see around you just popped into existence by chance. And that is the worst misrepresentation. It's not chance. There was an engine that designed the eye. The scientist merely believes that engine that designed the eye was not some supernatural god, which, by the way, explains nothing, but a natural process, natural selection, cumulative selection. So that's basically that. So the complexity of an eye is really nothing more than the result of many other steps that were less complex, that because of a need were slowly changed by random mutations into the complexity that we have now. So it is possible that life could get from nothing to what we have now, but it doesn't. But we don't necessarily know everything about the beginning. We just know that after that point, at some point, biological processes began to mutate through natural selection. One thing I want to talk about the argument of complexity also is when Paley and all these other people compare a watch and they say, this watch was designed, a car was designed, a jetpack was designed, this bookshelf was designed, how could you say that this other stuff in nature that's complex isn't designed? Well, the answer to that is, first of all, it's a miscomparison. The reason we know a watch was designed is because we know what watches are. They're a human invention. We know the pieces that go into them. We know their purpose because we've seen the factories. We've ample outside experience and an interaction with watches to know what they are, and if we picked one up, we would saw what it is. And the same goes with any other mechanical process. If we saw something that was mechanical, but we didn't know what it was, but it obviously had metal pieces, it had gears, it had workings of things that we recognize in other man-made designs, we would say, this looks like it might be a man-made design. Whereas, if you come upon a coral reef, and you don't know what a coral reef is, we have no examples of any factory or any parts going into this thing. We have no outside reference. We have no experience with any kind of designer or link to any definite designer that makes coral reefs. So things that are man-made designs, we can usually easily recognize that's a man-made design because it exhibits all these evidences of all these other things we've seen that are man-made designs. So I had an argument with someone once where they said, look at this bookcase. This thing was obviously designed. It serves a purpose, right? Back to the purpose thing. Its purpose is to store books. Are you telling me that you can imagine this thing just coming into existence or forming by itself with no designer? My answer is no, not for a bookcase, because I know what a bookcase is. If a bookcase was a biological, natural, or some kind of natural process in the universe and I came upon it and I didn't know what it was, then yes, I could say that. And it's much like, this may sound a little outlandish, but it's much like people saying the same thing about maybe the TV that's sitting in your living room. You might look at the TV that's sitting in your living room, and when you leave the room, it disappears out of existence and fails to exist anymore, but reappears 2 seconds before you come back into the room. But you wouldn't know the difference if it did that. Of course, everything we know from our experience tells us that those kind of things don't happen. But it is possible that a TV does that and forms itself. But the reason why we don't believe that, the reason why we wouldn't put any credit in that if somebody tried to postulate that, is because we know what a TV is. We have the experience. We recognize its man-made qualities. Nature is a completely different thing. The appearance of design that we see in nature, what we are doing is comparing those things like TVs, comparing things that happen to have similar attributes, that happen to have, well, wow, this is really complex. The iris of the eye is extremely complex, and much like a camera that we have designed based on the eye. And so this must have had a designer. Well, that's not necessarily the case with nature, because the designer, it does not have to be a personal creator god or someone that specifically put it together for a purpose. Rather, the engine of natural selection has been mutating these things for a need, for a purpose, to allow the species, whichever species carries this eye, to respond to a predator, or respond to a change in environment, or respond to whatever it needs to adapt so that it can continue its species. That appearance of design is really just a natural process, and it cannot be. It's a miscomparison to compare those natural processes with something like a jet engine or a car, because it's just simply not the same thing. All of those things we have experience and a direct link to something that we know, attributes that we know are human designed, whereas the coral reef or the complexity in a snowflake, those things we don't necessarily know, or we can't necessarily find any purpose behind them, but we can find an engine that is possible to make them, which would be natural selection and cumulative selection. There's more to this argument, but it has a lot to do with, I think, a misunderstanding of probability, like we talked about, and a miscomparison between a man-made object and a process in nature. There are many things that we don't know, and this will be another video. There are many things that we don't know about the beginning of the universe and everything, and people say, well, that because science changes and because we admit we don't know it, that it can't be relied on, and that's actually the opposite of the case. The strength of being able to rely on science is shown by the fact that it does change and that it does adapt, and that when new information comes, then the equations are reworked. So no one will say that we know everything. But what we do know is that the teleological argument complexity, just because it appears complex, does not mean it's design. That's a definite logical fallacy. And so this argument fails, much like the cosmological argument failed, and as well as fine tuning, which I consider like a subcategory of these two, fails, because just because something is teetering on the edge of destruction does not mean that it's set in place. It just means that it's sitting on the edge of destruction. That's it. And just because something's complex doesn't mean it's designed. It just means it's complex. And so the things that help explain how that could be are natural selection, cumulative selection, abiogenesis, and things like that, which I think theologians terribly misunderstand and misquote. And so we'll get into that. That'll be later as well. I'll do another video about some of these areas where misquotings and misunderstandings of scientific principles have come in. But for now, we'll stop with getting a little long-winded here, 20 minutes. With the teleological argument, I could do more on this, but this will be enough for now. And I'll post another summary online of the writing about this, or the written summary of the argument and where it fails. And we'll be moving on to another argument for God's existence that I'll show does not prove God's existence in any way, coming up in the next video. So thanks for listening. Philip Gregory with Philip Gregory Speaks, and I'll be back with another video soon. And look forward to an examination of all these arguments on YouTube. And please subscribe and leave me some comments if you enjoy what you're seeing. Thanks. Philip Gregory Speaks. Bye.